When we talk about the rings of power in Tolkien's writings, the focus often falls on the three rings borne by the elves, or on the one ring that rules them all. And there's nothing wrong with that, those rings are fascinating. But in this video, I want to tell the story of the other rings of power. Maya, Govan and Melanine, and welcome to another episode of Tolkien Untangled. Today I want to explore the origins of where these other rings of power came from, why they were made, and ultimately, what became of them. And at the very heart of the story of the rings stand two crucial characters, Celebrimbor, the elvish lord of Eregion, and Anatar, the Lord of Gifts. We really can't talk about the Rings of Power without first understanding these two figures. So I'll start with Celebrimbor. First and foremost, this guy is a master craftsman. In the First Age, his grandfather, Feanor, one of the most iconic elves in the Silmarillion, crafted the three Silmarils, for which the Silmarillion gets its name. He was the great genius of the First Age, and his grandson, Celebrimbor, is the great genius of the Second Age, the Forger of the Rings, a guy that Tolkien describes as having an almost dwarvish obsession with crafts. But Celebrimbor isn't just good at making things, he's also the lord of a great country, the elvish realm of Eregion. And in the Second Age, about 4,869 years before the Lord of the Rings begins, Eregion was a very cool place to be. The chief city in this realm is called Ostinethil, and it's here where Celebrimbor lives and rules from. And Ostinethil also serves as the headquarters for Celebrimbor's Guild of Elvish Jewelsmiths, his fellowship of master craftsmen, the Gwaith y Myrdain. Now, there is another character that I should really talk about here, but I'm a little bit reluctant to do so. In the words of Christopher Tolkien, there is no part of the history of Middle-earth more full of problems than the story of Galadriel and Celeborn. And when it comes to Celebrimbor and Eregion, this is even more so the case than usual. Tolkien didn't write much on Galadriel's actions in the Second and Third Ages beyond a short and hasty outline, very roughly composed, and what he did tell us, he often changed or refurbished. So I don't want to imply this is simpler than it actually is, but in most versions, Galadriel and her husband Celeborn and their daughter Celebrian are all part of this Eregion crew with Celebrimbor, whose father was Galadriel's cousin. And I do think Galadriel's residence in Eregion is an important part of explaining what it is that Eregion represents. But I'll come back to that. Because there's something else to say about this unique realm of the Noldor, that's the High Elves with the greatest affinity for knowledge and crafting and deep matters, and it's that in Eregion there exists a profound and enormously rare friendship between elves and dwarves. Right on Eregion's southern doorstep lies the dwarven kingdom of Khazad-dûm, the place that mines the Mithril, the realm that provides the jewelsmiths with all of their gems and their gold. In fact, it was a union of elves and dwarves, specifically Celebrimbor himself and a friend called Navi, who crafted the Eastern Gate of Moria, the Door of Durin, which the Fellowship of the Ring will one day enter through. In fact, Celebrimbor's name is even written in Tengwar, that's Elvish writing, on the door next to Navi's name. This interracial friendship is the reason why the password for that dwarvish door is an Elvish word for friend. Anyway, the reason I'm lingering on this point is because I want you to imagine Eregion as a place where elvish craftsmen and dwarvish craftsmen work together to celebrate their mutual love of creation. Eregion is a place where creation lies at the very heart of this realm's identity. And while I'm talking about this, there is another name that I have to mention, Aule. Now, Aule is not a guy who ever came to Eregion. He is one of the 14 Valar, part of the pantheon of the Uttermost West, who lives in Valinor alongside the other lords and ladies of the Valar. But Aule is kind of like a living embodiment of this spirit of crafting. In Tolkien's words, the delight and pride of Aule is in the deed of making and in the thing made. He is the smith of the Valar, the builder of mountains and the lord of rock, metal, and the fabric of the earth. Way back, when the very first elves first came to settle in Valinor, it was the Noldor who became Aule's students. Their love of craft was enriched by him, and he loved the Noldor in return. A few of them he even took as personal pupils, including both of Celebrimbor's known grandparents, Feanor and his wife Nerdanel, as well as his great-grandfather on his mother Nerdanel's side, and his father's cousin, Galadriel. In the Unfinished Tales, we are told Galadriel, like others of the Noldor, had been a pupil of Aule in Valinor. And we're also told that this is the reason for her natural sympathy with the dwarves. Because the Noldor are not the only people in Middle-earth who can claim to have this kind of special relationship with Aule the Smith. He created a great many things in Middle-earth's early history, but perhaps most significant of all, Aule is the creator of the race of dwarves. He made them from the earth, and for all intents and purposes, they are his children. I imagine, within Eregion during the Second Age, reverence for Aule must have been a real part of the culture of that place. Everyone's desire comes in some way back to him. However, I did say a few minutes ago that there are two characters at the heart of this story, and in addition to Lord Celebrimbor, we also have to talk about the Lord of Gifts, a mysterious stranger called Anatar. Unlike Celebrimbor and his Gwaithir Myrdain, Anatar is not an elf, and he's not a dwarf or a man either. Anatar came to Eregion as an emissary of the Uttermost West. He is a Maya, an angelic being created in the timeless halls before the universe was made. And back in the day, Anatar was also a pupil of the Valar Aule. In fact, among his many names, Anatar became known in Eregion as Aulendil, which means devoted to or servant of Aule. And he also becomes known as Artano, which means the High Smith, echoing Aule's title, the Great Smith. So, Anatar Aulendil Artano came to Eregion bearing the gift of knowledge. He came with an offer, and it was an offer that Lord Celebrimbor was all too glad to hear. Under this guy's tutelage, and with his experience of deep lore, Celebrimbor and the Gwaithir Myrdain recognized that they had in their grasp the potential to create something that Middle-earth had never seen before. You see, Anatar Aulendil told Celebrimbor that on the far side of the sea, in the uttermost west of Valinor, elves and Maiar lived together in absolute bliss alongside and within the radiance of the mighty Valar. But at the end of the First Age, Celebrimbor and Galadriel and Elrond and High King Gil-galad all passed up the opportunity to return there and to join their kin in that euphoric paradise of Valinor. They all had slightly different motives, but at the heart of each was a love of Middle-earth, a desire to remain there and to create something wonderful on this relatively blank canvas. However, in Middle-earth, things decay, they wither, and eventually they die. Even the deathless elves must fade in the end. But that doesn't have to be the case. What Anatar Aulendil pitches to Celebrimbor and his Gwaithir Myrdain is a way to achieve true, deathlessness, to make their realms in Middle-earth blessed, and then to preserve them, to be totally free of the ravages of time, to escape loss entirely. According to this emissary, Middle-earth could be made as blissful as Valinor itself, and the elves of Eregion should be the ones who make it so. It is their task to labor alongside him, Anatar, in the enriching and elevating and ennobling of this land, and also of its inhabitants. And all Celebrimbor has to do to bring this wonderful dream into fruition is accept that gift of knowledge from Anatar. Just allow the Lord of Gifts to teach him the art of forging rings of power. In hindsight, what Celebrimbor did next was a mistake. But if he hadn't done it, there would be no story. In the end, Celebrimbor accepted the friendship of the Lord of Gifts. He made Anatar welcome in Ostina Dhil, and Eregion profited greatly. Before long, the Gwaithir Myrdain was studying under Anatar's tutelage, and in those days, the smiths of Ostina Dhil surpassed all that they had contrived before. They began forging lesser rings, only essays in the craft before it was full grown, and the fate of these lesser rings remains highly mysterious. They're only mentioned a handful of times by Tolkien, and always in the vaguest of ways. But we can safely speculate that some of the original rings, the very beginning of the Gwaithir Myrdain's ring-forging enterprise, were still kicking around by the time of The Lord of the Rings and The Hobbit. In fact, that's what Gandalf originally presumes, and really hopes, Bilbo's invisibility ring is. Something magical, but not a true ring of power. Those were forged a few centuries later. Anatar spent 300 years in Eregion with Celebrimbor, and in that time they forged 16 true rings of power together. They are the Gwaithir Myrdain's magnum opus, and the plan was these great rings would be borne by 16 great elvish lords or ladies who will use them to craft Middle-earth into paradise. The elves of Eregion were the ones who forged them, but it was Anatar's knowledge and his skill and his lore that brought them into being. However, the 16 were not the absolute finest rings ever forged in Eregion. After 3 centuries of guiding and teaching and giving gifts of knowledge, Anatar departed the elvish realm and he disappeared somewhere into the south. And while Anatar was gone, Celebrimbor tried his hand at forging 3 great rings all on his own. These 3 rings are remembered as the 3 elvish rings of power, and they are epic, but I have already talked about them in a good deal of detail in previous videos, so I'll not worry too much about them right now. Because only about a decade after Celebrimbor forged his 3 rings of power totally independently of Anatar Aulendil Artano, Anatar was forging a ring of his own, totally independently of Celebrimbor. 1 ring to bind them all. I imagine most of you guys have already seen through this Anatar ruse, but it's at this moment in the story when the truth is revealed to Celebrimbor and the elves of Eregion. When Anatar put on his ruling ring, his fair disguise was broken. Celebrimbor immediately becomes aware that this Lord of Gifts was not the friend he claimed to be. He was a deceiver. Not an emissary of the West, but a former servant of the original Dark Lord. A new power rising to take his place. Anatar was only ever an alias for Sauron, the Lord of the Rings. When Celebrimbor learns of this, he begins preparation for war. The 16 rings are in Eregion. The 3 rings are also in Eregion, and the 1 ring is coming north from Mordor with an army. And I do want to take a moment to make a point about Celebrimbor here. It's true, he did unknowingly collaborate with Sauron and aid his sinister ring agenda, and it is true that when Sauron approached Galadriel and Gil-galad and Elrond in a fair form, they did refuse him. But still, I want to defend Celebrimbor. I think he's epic. He makes me think a little bit of like an elvish Boromir. You know, he's a fundamentally good guy, but he does disagree a little bit with the general consensus when it comes to whether or not Sauron's dodgy rings might actually be a good thing that they should use. He does have a moment of poor decision-making, but still, he is a character worthy of immense respect. What Boromir did wrong is totally eclipsed by all the awesome stuff he did right, and I think it's the same with Celebrimbor. And in both cases, after making their mistakes, both Boromir and Celebrimbor bloody well make up for it. They both meet an untimely end, but they are both utterly redeemed when that end comes. So, perceiving that his 3 rings, which have never had any input from Sauron, they've never been touched by any non-elvish hands, Celebrimbor sends them away from Eregion to keep them safe. They are the rings that Sauron wants most. The stakes are highest for the elvish rings. One of them he gives to his father's cousin, Galadriel, and the other 2 he gives to his High King, Gil-galad, who later divvies them between Elrond and Círdan the Shipwright. But the 16 rings Celebrimbor intends to defend. 493 years after Annatar arrived in Eregion, the War of the Elves and Sauron began. This new Dark Lord had hoped to conquer through manipulation and deceit, but now Celebrimbor was aware of him, and so military might was gonna have to do. Now, the story of the fall of Eregion is a long and very interesting one, and I'll definitely do a video all about it one day, but for the purposes of this video, we really only need the cliff notes. Firstly, Sauron failed to reclaim Celebrimbor's 3. The elvish rings of power remained with their guardians, and they are never, ever brought under Sauron's dominion. Second, Celebrimbor's realm of Eregion was strengthened by an army of dwarves from Khazad-dûm, marching to the elves' aid under the command of their king, Durin III. When things in Eregion were at their darkest, this unique friendship forged between Celebrimbor and Na'vi held true. In fact, according to some dwarvish traditions, Celebrimbor himself even gave one of his 16 rings of power to his friend, King Durin III. And thirdly, although Celebrimbor and his allies do fight valiantly, and the 3 rings do remain free of Sauron forever, this is a war they are destined to lose. In the 4th year of that war, Eregion was laid to waste. Ostina Dhil was sacked, the house of the Myrdain fell, and Celebrimbor was taken by the enemy. Tolkien tells us almost nothing about Celebrimbor's final confrontation with the Dark Lord, but considering the relationship these two shared for 400 years, considering the manipulation and the betrayal, I have to imagine it was pretty explosive. Celebrimbor was tortured by Sauron and forced under torment to reveal the location of the 16, the rings they made together. But despite every lick of suffering inflicted upon him by the Dark Lord, Celebrimbor never gave up the locations of the 3. I imagine he knew he'd unwittingly aided Sauron all those years ago, and now, even under torture, he would never help the Dark Lord again. In the end, Sauron tortured Celebrimbor to his death, The great craftsman's body was then shot with arrows and hung on a pole, a gruesome banner to be paraded by Sauron's enemies as they continued waging their war upon the Noldor. And the 16 Rings of Power, they were claimed by Sauron. Which brings us to the part of the story you're probably already familiar with. After actually losing the War of the Elves and Sauron thanks to Gil-galad, Elrond, and the intervention of some Númenóreans, Sauron divided the 16 rings into 9 and 7, or 6 if we go with that version where Celebrimbor had already given a ring to King Durin. Anyway, these rings Sauron gave as gifts after he'd corrupted them. We are told all those rings that he governed, he perverted, since he had a hand in their making, and they were accursed, and they betrayed, in the end, all those that used them. As you surely know, the 9 rings Sauron gave to mortal men, one of whom was an Easterling with the name Khamûl, and 3 of whom were great Númenórean lords. I presume the future Witch King of Angmar was one of them. The 9 men who wielded these rings achieved great power with them, and they became mighty in their day. Kings, sorcerers, and warriors of old. They obtained glory and great wealth, yet it turned to their undoing. They had unending life, yet life became unendurable. They could walk unseen by all eyes in this world beneath the sun, and they could see things in worlds invisible to mortal men. But too often they beheld only the phantoms and delusions of Sauron. One by one, according to their native strength and to the good or evil of their wills, they fell under the thraldom of the ring that they bore, and under the domination of the One. And they became forever invisible save to him that wore the ruling ring, and they entered into the realm of shadows. It seems that the 9 rings shifted their bearers from the seen, material world into the immaterial, unseen world. There they beheld visions and delusions, and gradually they became utterly enslaved. Interestingly, though, we can see one area in which the Rings of Power do fulfill their original purpose. So long as the ruling ring endures, the One Ring, the bearers of the 9 are deathless. Life has become unendurable, but Sauron has indeed preserved something that was never meant to last: a mortal life. Eventually, the 9 bearers of the 9 rings became so inherently bound to them that they no longer even needed to wear them. And so, by the Third Age and the time of the Lord of the Rings, the 9 Rings of Power are all back in Sauron's possession, safely kept by him in his Tower of Barad-dûr. However, the other rings, the ones we call the 7, the ones given to the dwarves, they worked a little bit differently. Or perhaps I should say, dwarves work a little bit differently. In Tolkien's words, the dwarves proved tough and hard to tame. They ill endure the domination of others, nor can they be turned to shadows. They use their rings only for the getting of wealth. But wrath and an overmastering greed of gold were kindled in their hearts, of which evil enough after came to the profit of Sauron. It was said that of the 7 great treasure hoards of the dwarf kings of old, presumably 1 hoard per dwarven clan, each one had as its foundation a golden ring. And although these 7 rings failed to enslave their bearers and turn them into like miniature dwarf-sized Nazgûl like the 9 rings did, they did end up doing excellent things for Sauron's cause nonetheless. This gold lust that the rings kindled in dwarven hearts attracted the attention of the greediest of all Middle-earth's inhabitants, dragons. We know almost nothing about the details except that long ago, every one of those dwarf hoards was plundered and their wealth stolen by their enemies. And in 4 of those 7 instances, so more than half, the dwarvish rings of power were not only taken, they were destroyed, devoured by dragons, or melted by dragon fire. Which is interesting for a number of reasons. Firstly, although this sucks for the dwarves, it also kinda sucks for Sauron. His plan was to deceive 16 great kings or lords by gifting them rings of power. They would then become bound to their rings, enslaved to the will of Sauron, so that eventually, when he reclaimed them, the bearers would be eternally and entirely under Sauron's dominion. But those 4 rings devoured by dragons, consumed by dragon fire, they are now completely out of the Dark Lord's reach. Presumably their bearers were also killed by these dragons, which is unfortunate for them, but in death, those dwarf lords are now free of Sauron. They get to go back to Aule. Not at all what Sauron intended. Also, the fact that dragonfire is hot enough to melt these rings of power demonstrates how the 16 made by Celebrimbor and Sauron together are fundamentally different from the one that Sauron made alone. In The Lord of the Rings, Gandalf tells us, "It has been said that dragonfire could melt and consume the rings of power, but not even Ancalagon the Black, the biggest, baddest dragon ever to exist, could have harmed the One Ring." However, this detail about dragons consuming rings does raise a few questions. Like, firstly, which dragons? And also, which rings? The truth is, we have no idea. Tolkien gives us almost nothing to go on here, but in Middle-earth, there are 7 clans of dwarves living in 7 dwarven strongholds, and 7 rings were given to 7 dwarven lords who amass 7 separate treasure hoards. So although it's not absolutely certain, I think we can confidently speculate that there was 1 ring given to each of the 7 dwarven clans. 2 of those clans are the Firebeards and the Broadbeams, who live in the Blue Mountains far to the west of Middle-earth, and there are 4 more ultra-mysterious clans living in the east, in Rhûn, presumably in or around the Red Mountains. The other clan is the Longbeards, Durin's folk of Khazad-dûm in the Misty Mountains, and their king bears the ring that was supposedly given to Durin III not by Sauron, but by his buddy Celebrimbor. But I'll get to that ring in just a minute. Of the other 6, we know that 4 were consumed by dragons, and 2 were reclaimed by Sauron, either in the late Second Age or in the early Third Age. But we have no idea how this breaks down. I suppose Occam's razor might suggest the most straightforward explanation would be that the 4 rings in the east were destroyed by dragons, and the 2 in the west were reclaimed by Sauron. But that's just a guess. We're never told of any dragons attacking the Blue Mountains, but we're also never told of Sauron sending any agents there to get his rings back. The truth is, we just don't know. And what about those 4 ring-swallowing dragons? Or I don't know, maybe just 1 dragon who swallowed a ring of power 4 different times. Were the rings destroyed in their bellies, like turned into inert magicless gold, or did they somehow imbue their dragons with some sort of power from within? It's a fascinating thing to speculate on, but I'm afraid speculating is all we can do. However, this brings us to the last of those 16 rings, or perhaps the first. The first one to be given away, the first one to be separated from the others, but the last one Sauron ever got back. The ring apparently given to Durin III by Celebrimbor. The reason this dwarven legend matters, and the reason I keep saying apparently or supposedly, is because if it's true, and who knows if it is, there's a good bit of evidence to suggest it's not true, but if it is, that would mean the dwarves of Khazad-dûm can claim the distinction of never having anything to do with Sauron. Yes, they have one of his rings, but it was given to them by Lord Celebrimbor, not by the Deceiver. Either way, this ring remains in dwarven hands for a very long time, and it illustrates the extent to which rings of power just don't work the way they're supposed to when it comes to dwarves. We don't know how or when Durin III died, but we know that he did, so his ring clearly didn't give him unending life like it did to the Nazgul. And even if it did, even if Durin only died because he chose to relinquish his ring and his life along with it, passing it on to the next generation, that's not something that any mortal man with a ring of power could ever do. For almost 4,000 years, Durin's Ring of Power remained in Khazad-dûm, in the possession of Khazad-dûm's king, until the death of Durin VI, almost 2,000 years into the Third Age. Durin VI is the guy for whom the Balrog, Durin's Bane, gets its name. After the awakening of said Balrog and the subsequent destruction and depopulating of Khazad-dûm, the ring passed to Durin VI's son, a guy called Nine. And when Nine died only 1 year later, the ring passed to Nine's son, Thrain. And Thrain was the king who first founded the Kingdom of Erebor. He's the one who brought Durin's folk to the Lonely Mountain, and he gave rise to a new dwarven stronghold that would go on to amass a new dwarven treasure hoard, which was destined to one day be conquered by a new dragon. Anyway, Thrain passed his Ring of Power down through his sons and on through their sons until eventually it passed to a mighty king called Thror, grandfather of Thorin Oakenshield. When Smaug the dragon attacked Erebor and forced the dwarves to relocate, King Thror took his Ring of Power with him. A few years later, he decided it'd be a good idea to try and reclaim Khazad-dûm all by himself. Spoiler alert, it wasn't a good idea, but before Thror departed on that doomed adventure, he bestowed his ring to his son, Thrain II. And Thrain II was the last dwarf ever to bear it. In the 40 years that followed King Thror's death, Thrain became more and more obsessed with all the ancestral wealth that was just lying there within Erebor. Perhaps his Ring of Power had something to do with stoking that gold lust. Regardless, only 91 years before the events of The Hobbit, King Thrain set out east towards the Lonely Mountain. However, on the eaves of the Forest of Mirkwood, Thrain disappeared, and he would never be seen again by any dwarf ever. His fate remained a mystery. Until 9 years later, Gandalf the Grey went on a reconnaissance mission to the evil necromancer's stronghold of Dol Guldur, Sauron's Third Age fortress in Mirkwood. And in the dungeons of Dol Guldur, Gandalf found a dwarf, tortured and so diminished he no longer knew his own name. Shortly after meeting Gandalf, he died in those dungeons. But, as Gandalf would soon go on to learn, this tragic dwarf was in fact King Thrain. He was captured in Mirkwood by Sauron's agents, and so, finally, 4,691 years after Anatar Aulendil Artano came to Eregion, the last of the 16 rings that weren't destroyed by dragons was returned to the Dark Lord's possession. However, only 169 years after that, Sauron's ruling ring, something he never reclaimed after it was lost, fell into the crack of doom. It was destroyed. The one ring that bound all other rings of power was unmade, and so all other rings lost their powers. The 9 and what remained of the 7 were presumably buried in the ruin of Barad-dûr, but even if they were refound in the Fourth Age, they wouldn't be able to do anything. Without the ruling ring, the other rings of power are simply circular pieces of metal. If you're wondering why the 16, which were of course made before the 1, lose their power after the One Ring's destruction, that is a very good question, and it's one that I go into a fair bit of detail on in my One Ring video. However, to wrap up this video, I want to end by pointing out how from Sauron's perspective, the Rings of Power did not turn out to be quite the slam dunk he was hoping for back in the Second Age. 9 of them did provide him with 9 Nazgul, and they were pretty helpful, but when it mattered most, they failed to get the ruling ring back to their master, and the 7 turned out to be, indirectly, a little bit helpful in weakening Dwarven resistance, but when it came to binding that race, no, complete waste of time. And Celebrimbor's 3, the ones Sauron never got his hands on, the ones he wanted most, by the time of The Lord of the Rings, those rings belonged to Gandalf, Elrond, and Galadriel. And I'm sure you don't need me to tell you, all 3 of those great keepers played a pivotal role in aiding the Ringbearer's quest to destroy the One. When Sauron's ring fell into the fire, his power was forever vanquished. His 16 rings turned out, in the end, to be a bit of a disappointment, but the 3 he never touched. The elvish rings that escaped him, they went on to provide protection and preservation for secret realms like Rivendell and Lothlorien, lands where no shadow ever lay, and where the forces of death and decay and fading had no power. It would seem almost 5,000 years after his brutal, torturous death, Lord Celebrimbor of Eregion got the last laugh. Anyway, thank you very much for watching this video. I hope you enjoyed it. If you did, be sure to hit like and leave a comment and click subscribe to make sure you don't miss any future videos coming soon. However, until next time, as always, my dear friends, much love. Stay groovy and Nevair Melanin.